"You're not going anywhere dressed like that." The words landed like a slam of a door more than a sentence. They had the weight of marble, the finality of a household rule read from a ledger. Clara's heels stopped mid-click on the polished floor. The music of her own breath filled the vastness of the foyer, her pulse answering the echo of those words. He stood at the foot of the stairs as if the darkness itself had put on a shape, broad-shouldered, shirt sleeves rolled back, face caught in half-shadow. Renan's tie lay loose, the silk undone the way people undo themselves when sleep won't come. He had come downstairs as if he'd been waiting for her to make a motion he could stall, and there she was, in a dress that felt like a small rebellion, navy, hem modest but new, a borrowed pair of heels that pinched politely at the toes. She had spent an hour on her hair, pinning it up into something that looked, just for one night, careful. A little lipstick sold as courage. Outside, a car idled, headlights washing the grand gate in yellow. Clara's phone vibrated on her wrist. A friend texted a string of little fires, "Be there in 10." And she could have been on that car, gone in a minute, the night waiting like a promise. Instead, she took a breath that tasted faintly of the jasmine that climbed the front wall and said, "Good night, Mr. Renan." He didn't move. The line between them was a distance of air and authority. "You're not going anywhere dressed like that," he repeated, voice flat now, as if he were reciting rules she should already know. "Excuse me?" Clara said. She let at least a little of the crimson on her lips break into something sharper. "I'm not asking permission to go out of the house." Renan's jaw tightened. For a moment, his grief showed like a bruise beneath the surface, old hurt that had hardened into a kind of territorial fear. He lowered his voice so that it sounded both intimate and dangerous. "It's not safe. Mel is asleep upstairs. You should be here." She laughed once because the alternative, anger, was older and costlier. "Since when are you my chaperone? Since when are you making this house look like a risk?" He stepped forward and didn't bother with a polite distance. His silhouette filled the doorway as if the house itself had put a hand on the latch. "You can't go out like that, Clara. People see you. They make assumptions." The word assumptions tasted like accusation. Clara could feel the burn at the back of her throat. All the night she had altered herself to the slow, practical demands of the house, teaching Mel to tie her shoes, making sure the guest towels were not pilfered, waking before dawn to iron shirts so Renan didn't have to, had been folded into a quiet presence that the household favored. Tonight she had stepped outside that margin, and it showed in the small but decisive curve of a dress. "My life isn't for other people's assumptions," she said. "This isn't you to decide." Renan's hand, when it moved, was both a plea and a barrier. He rested it against the banister, an old gesture of ownership masquerading as concern. "You know how it looks for the child. People make judgments. People talk. I can't have Mel's life complicated by—" "By what?" Clara interrupted. "By me having a life?" He looked at her then, and for an instant the mask slipped. Exhaustion and something raw and animal in grief softened his stern features. "By anything that might make your attention split," he said. "By things you take on that don't belong here. You are responsible here." The word responsible landed differently in her ears. It had been the currency of her life for years, responsible for a family that was barely hanging together, responsible for the little girl who had taken to pressing her cheek against Clara's after a nightmare. She had chosen to be responsible because it paid rent, because it fed her mother, because dignity sometimes had to be bartered. But the phrase carried an underside, responsible for the house's image, responsible as if her personhood were part of the decor. "You're treating me like part of the furniture," Clara said. "I won't be your exhibit of decency." Renan's throat worked. He looked at her hands, at the small, tired scar at the base of her thumb, where the iron had once slipped 3 years ago. He saw, perhaps for the first time in a way that wasn't filtered through contempt or convenience, that she was not ornamental. "You don't understand what it's like," he said finally. "You can't imagine." "I don't have to imagine," she said. "I know what it's like to be stopped from living. You don't get to decide when I'm allowed to leave this house." The driver, a quiet man who had been waiting in the shadows by the gate, tapped on his tablet and received instructions through the air. When Clara's phone buzzed, the small message that popped up, "Your ride has been cancelled," was both petty and devastating. She had tried to keep it together, had rehearsed how she would be light and casual, but the text flattened the night into a single small humiliation. The car's headlights dimmed and then vanished. The gate slid shut with a final polite click. Clara's hand tightened on the banister. It was only a banister, only wood and varnish, but it had been their history of small restraining decisions, the house's schedules, the list of do's and don'ts pinned like rules to the air. She had thought that one night, one borrowed dress would be harmless. There was a life she wanted outside these walls, a life that involved seeing a friend, laughter in a dim place with a drink that wasn't tea at 11 p.m., and suddenly it felt as if that life had been translated into offense. "Renan," she said, "if you don't put your driver on hold this minute, I'll call my friend down the street. I'll walk. I can take the bus." "You will not walk out of this house at midnight while Mel sleeps," he said. "Not when I can." He stopped, as if the edges of his sentence might cut something tender. "Listen, I can have the driver take you for a quick circle. If you really must, we'll manage it in a way that doesn't make a spectacle." A spectacle. The word came like a curse. Clara's spine straightened. "I'm not a spectacle." He moved to the doorway, as if to close it, his hand on the frame. "And neither am I," he said. "I can't have people drawing conclusions about how this house is run. You can't have me live at the edge of your grief," she finished. "I won't be put on display so you can pretend everything is in place." Silence pooled between them. The foyer was too big for apologies to be small. The chandelier glittered above them like indifferent witnesses. In the seconds' quiet, Clara could hear the city beyond the gate. Distant horns, the soft thrum of someone else's life. Her own breath tasted of jasmine and metal. Renan's eyes flicked away from her face. For the briefest of breaths, he was a man reduced to one ache. Mel. Then he seemed to collect himself like a person rearranging his armor. "This isn't about you," he said. "It's about—" He stopped, and the rest unsaid was something she could fill with stories. About his late wife, about how fragile everything felt, how any hiccup sent splinters through him, about the way any change felt like a threat. "I don't want to be strings on your marionette," Clara said. "If you think my clothes make me less fit to care for Mel, tell me that. Tell me you won't trust me. But don't pretend you can dictate every small thing in my life." He held her gaze. For a fast, sharp minute, something like recognition moved over his face, an awareness that his power, while real, might be the thin skin over a different wound. "I worry about her," he said softer. "I worry about—" "You worry about everything," Clara said. "You worry about the wrong things." Her last words were not kind, and they carried the truth. He winced as if the truth had struck him. Then, abruptly, Renan's hand left the frame, not in concession, but as a kind of surrender. He spoke more quietly now, each syllable measured. "If you're set on going, then go," he said. "But not dressed like that." Clara's laugh was small and bitter. "So now it's about my dress, not about what's best for Mel." "It's about image," he said. "For the child's school, for visitors. Don Matilde will—" Renan's mother had a crown of social vigilance that made Clara's teeth ache. Donna Matilde's opinion was the sort that could ripple through the household and make small things into public scandals. Clara didn't want to be the spark for any conversation held on the wrong side of a marble table. But she had chosen this night because for once she could try to be something other than invisible. "This is ridiculous," she said. She moved to put her hand on the banister, to descend a step, and in that motion she tried to be graceful and calm. "I'm leaving to have one night." He said nothing. Instead, he picked up his phone and walked to the side table as if to call someone. The driver watched, waiting for orders. The car outside waited as if patient. Clara felt the air around her shrink in actual inches. It was a recognizable kind of pressure, the kind that had, through years, taught her which words to keep and which to discard. She imagined explaining this night to her mother, how the one small pleasure had been cancelled by someone else's unease, and the indignity of it flushed her cheeks. "You don't get to tell me what I wear in my life," she said finally, too loud for the foyer. "I work for you. I'm not your property." Renan's jaw clenched and his voice hardened. "You're also the person who is here to make sure the house doesn't fall. And the person who has a life outside these walls," she interrupted. "Who feeds her mother with the money she earns. Who deserves to be allowed out of the house without having her morals or her entire character questioned because you feel threatened." He looked at her longer than he had looked at her in months. There was something raw that didn't make it all the way to apology. "I am threatened," he said, in a voice that was both an admission and a confession. "I'm terrified of losing what little control I have left." "For Mel's sake," Clara said. She noticed, as she said it, that Mel was sleeping like a small planet upstairs, unaware of the orbit of adult decisions turning below. "For the child's sake, I want you to see me as an adult." Renan's hand trembled when he put it to his face. He took a breath that escaped as a weary sound and looked at the staircase, the marble banister catching the light. "Please," he said finally, softer than the first time. "Just tonight, for the child's sake." Clara stared at him, the words like a net thrown over them both. "For the child's sake," she echoed, tasting all the ways it could be used and misused. The driver shifted his weight, an anonymous man whose loyalty had been bought with hours and courtesy, and the night outside seemed to press itself against the glass like a witness. She could leave. She could call a friend and walk to the subway and be gone. She could return to the life that paid the bills and kept her mother's apartment warm and never draw attention to herself again. But she could also feel, in the deep place under her ribs, the stubborn bloom of something that had been denied for years. The right to choose a small joy. The right to be allowed a night that was hers. Clara rested her hand on the banister. "All right," she said at last. "No dress, no heels." Renan's shoulders lowered as if a knot had been released. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in that syllable that made her want to refuse him out of spite. Instead, she took off the heels slowly, feeling foolish and fierce both. She folded them and put them under the chair, tucking them away like contraband. She smoothed the dress into the crook of her arm, transformed within the house into the utilitarian uniform she always wore. A sensible blouse, a skirt she'd ironed in the early morning hours. The friend still waited, the small fire of the night out, reduced to polite embers. Renan watched her with a complicated look, part gratitude, part bewilderment. As she moved past him toward the door, he said, "Tomorrow, we'll talk about boundaries." She didn't answer. She left, steps softer now, the night shrinking but not gone. Outside, the city smelled of rain even though the sky was clear, a memory of storms. Clara walked past the closed gate and straight to the bus stop across the street. It would be slow, but it would be her own feet carrying her. When the bus came, it carried her not into the restaurant lights she had imagined, but toward a modestly lit cafe where her friend had agreed to meet her for a late cup and conversation that would be quick and honest. It would not be the velvet of cinema nights. It would be a small, honest thing. Two women talking and laughing, a brief touch of normalcy. Inside the house, Renan watched the gate close and then turned slowly back into the foyer, where light pooled like an accusation. He stood alone for a long time, hearing the faint echo of Clara's heartbeat under the dress she left folded on a chair. His hand drifted to the banister where she had placed her palm and held it there, as if to catch the warmth of a life he'd tried, awkwardly and painfully, to control. If he had wanted to make amends, perhaps his next move should have been simpler. A note, a change to his tone, a easing of the undercurrent of control. But grief was a country with strange laws, and he moved within its borders with the clumsy gait of someone who had lost his map. He didn't notice the way Donna Matilde's voice would later weave through afternoon tea like an undertow of judgment. He didn't notice some things until they had already hardened into habit. Clara's return to the house the next day carried the small residue of that night, a taste of what might have been, threaded with irritation. Morning domesticity embraced them both, a fabric neither could tear completely. The child's laugh in the kitchen, a rhyme performed at 7 a.m., made any adult quarrel petty and real at the same time. Clara woke early, as she always did, and prepared Mel's breakfast bubbles of cereal, the steam of toast lifting like a small necessary ritual. Renan came down with the weight of the night still in his shoulders. For a few moments in the hall he almost looked younger, as if the heavy suit frayed enough to reveal a man who could be softened by sleep. Donna Matilde's portrait looked down from the dining room as if patience itself had a face. "Clara," he said at the table, voice clipped around edges. He placed a small envelope on the far corner, as if the distance between them could be measured in paper. The driver apologized about last night. His eyes flicked toward Mel, who was humming a children's song with toast in one hand. "I'd like to offer compensation for the inconvenience." Clara felt the old muscle of caution spring up in her chest. Money was a clean solution, a rapid decimal on an awkward night. It was how he often remediated discomfort. A check, an extra day of paid leave, increased hours that covered for what he thought might be a social smoothing issue. He meant well in the way that wealth can mean. It was his language of repair. She folded her hands. Mel reached for a piece of toast and left a buttered smudge on the mug by Clara's elbow. The lipstick mark from yesterday's effort, where she had dabbed at it absent-mindedly, left a pale crescent that would later haunt simple gestures. She looked at Renan, and then at the envelope as if they were attempting to bargain for her dignity. "Mr. Renan," she said, because the house passed authority like a thermostat. "I appreciate the thought, but you didn't have to." "I'm offering it because I value you," he interrupted, the old confusion between possession and care making his voice clumsy. "You missed an evening because of me. That shouldn't happen." She put on a plain expression. "You don't decide when I lose my evenings, sir. I do. I chose to stay." He almost looked surprised. "You chose?" he said, the word dropping into the room like a small, fragile sea creature. "Yes," she said. "I chose to stay because I thought—" She stopped. Saying more would be like handing him a weapon shaped like pity. "Because I wanted to be considerate of Mel. But this is not something you fix with money." Renan's face made an elided shape. For a person who had built his life on quarterly reports and tidy numbers, the misalignment between his instinct to compensate and the child's needs of attention, intangibles that did not fit neat budgets, was hard to measure. He shifted, the gesture small. "I didn't mean—" "I know," Clara said. "But meaning isn't all that matters." Mel chattered as if the adult conversation were a radio in the next room. She had been sleeping through the night lately, her nightmares fewer, and Clara had a hand that knew the smallness of a child's body and its capacity for immediate forgiveness. She kissed Mel's forehead once, a touch that left a mark human in its gentle insistence. Renan watched with that look he improvised when he tried to read the world in facial expressions, an expression learned from years of negotiation but never quite reaching the soft edges of intimacy. He moved as if to gather himself, and then left in a series of small, tidy motions, His call to the office, the crisp tie adjusted, the habit of a man accustomed to stepping into roles he thought would shelter him. The day unfolded in that thin politeness that holds towering things together. Clara performed her tasks with an almost surgical attention. The child's socks were matched, the spare towel folded precisely. There was a ritual in the way she moved through the rooms, a choreography that had kept her employed and kept Mel's small orbit steady. But the friction of the night lingered in undercurrent pulses. A driver who had cancelled on a whim, a man who assumed the right to decide for another adult, a woman who had had her small plan rescinded by the weight of someone else's panic. When the afternoon came, the house softened with late light. Renan found reasons to be in the library he rarely used, the space lined with books that had been both company and silence. He saw her there as if for the first time, not in the line of duty, not with a list, but with a moment to herself. "Do you like this one?" he asked, holding a volume he did not intend to read aloud. The gesture was a thin attempt at civility. Clara looked up from the ironing she had brought to the quiet room, small domestic tasks made sacred in the hush of the library. "It's a history of architecture," she said, "for people who think about how walls speak." He smiled at that, the expression a brief window of human softness. "I suppose these walls speak all right," he said. "Sometimes they shout." She had expected the day to be strict and straight, her relationship with the household tidy and practical. But the way he sat in the library, the way the afternoon light feathered through his hair, softened him. His loneliness had been a presence ever since the funeral. It was not pretty, but it was human, and it drew a small, reluctant compassion out of her. They began to talk in short, careful sentences that didn't have to be businesslike. It was dangerous ground. The house had rules about the intimacy of employees and employers, and Clara knew them. But there was a moment in the way Renan asked about Mel's drawings, about the small rituals of bedtime, in which the teacher and the parent slipped briefly into the commonplace of sharing. He confessed to being afraid of doing something wrong. She confessed how tired she was at the end of the week. Their exchange was an odd kind of confession, neither sacramental nor theatrical, just people naming their small truths. He offered her a glass of wine from somewhere he kept for guests, the bottle more ceremonial than ordinary, and she declined at first, then accepted because the afternoon seemed to hang like an item that might be rescued by warmth. The wine was quiet, a little smug about its own age, and they sat with the steam of it and the honest sound of pages rustling. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked after a while, not a command but a question that hovered like a candle between them. She thought about it, about the apartment where her mother slept with the radio on low, about the bills that waited with humble patience, about the way a night out felt like oxygen. "Every day," she said finally. "But then I come back because someone's always waiting. My mother Mel. Life is a ledger." He nodded, as if ledgers were familiar things. "I suppose grief rearranges ledgers," he said. "You forget where you put your next joy." There was a small silence. The library smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil from the furniture polish. Clara watched him as he looked at a line of books arranged by height, each spine a promise of order. She could have left the room. She could have gone back to the kitchen and folded towels until the feeling passed. Instead, she stayed because curiosity had its own gravity. "Do you ever miss being careless?" she asked, the question honest and sharp. Renan's mouth twitched. "Careless is such an expensive luxury," he said. "You don't get to be careless when people depend on you." "Sometimes you should," she said, because she had been careful all her life, and it had taught her nothing about courage but much about survival. He looked at her then in a way that made her aware of the faint scar at his temple that no one ever mentioned, the mark his grief had left on his face. "Maybe," he said softly. "Maybe I should be more careless." The conversation drifted and found itself in an odd harbor of mutual recognition. Their words were cautious sailors. They skirted reef and found, in the calm, a small warmth. He confessed, without drama, the nights he woke and listened for a child's breath that wasn't his. She admitted wanting sometimes to go into a bar and let strangers talk about things that didn't matter. They did not speak of kisses or futures. They spoke of absence, as if mapping the sore spots might make them less painful. The wine loosened something not like desire, so much as a human reach toward another person's small necessary light. When his hand brushed hers, an accident at first, then lingered, it felt ordinary and strange. Clara didn't pull away. She was careful, always. Her consent was not the fruit of intoxication, but a deliberate private allowance. "Are you sure?" he asked, the question not about propriety but about step and consequence. She swallowed and met his eyes. "Yes," she said. Their kiss was short, hesitant, and then more certain, a bruise of warmth against workaday days. It was not cinematic. It was not an erasure of the power that lay between them. It was, instead, two people meeting at a line of loneliness and trying to see if their hands fit together. There was consent as a small, steady agreement, a mutual decision that did not erase risk. When they parted, the room seemed to rearrange. The book on architecture looked for a moment like a relic of convention. Clara's pulse skittered in a new rhythm. She rose to her feet and smoothed her skirt not out of propriety, but because the small action anchored her to the practical world she could not abandon. "That was a mistake," Renan said, voice threadbare between apology and confession. She shook her head. "Not necessarily," she said, and the words were true and dangerous both. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had shifted. Inside, the house rearranged itself too, the air thicker with questions that could not be answered by a casual measure of time. Mel's laughter floated from another room, an unknowing counterpoint to two adults rearranging edges of boundaries. Clara left the library with the measured care of someone who knew the cost of small decisions. The house seemed to watch her as she passed, furnishings lined like an audience, portraits looking down with that steady, curious certainty that came with being seen. She thought about the taxi that had been cancelled the night before, about the way she had changed out of a dress to suit another person's comfort. She thought about herself as someone who, if she was honest, enjoyed the music of her own company as much as anyone else's. When she reached Mel's room to tuck in the little girl for an afternoon nap, the child clung to her without drama. Mel's small hands gripped Clara's sleeve. The child's breathing deepened in sleep like the closing of a lid on small things. It was in those hands, those small, unadorned gestures that Clara found a tether to a life that could hold both duty and a quiet desire. Renan watched, perhaps without intention, as Clara smoothed the blanket over Mel. For a moment he saw not a servant, but a woman whose economy of tenderness had been stretched across a life that had little room for rest. There was a thin, stabbing ache of jealousy at something unnamed, but it was softened by gratitude. He had, after all, hired her to be reliable. He had not hired her to be a mirror of his better self. Yet she had, in the afternoon's raw exchange, reflected something he had not seen: resilience and a world of small pleasures he had forgotten. "Thank you," he said then, the words small enough to be true and not too much to demand. She looked up, and there was an understanding between them, of boundaries blurred, of unspoken debts. Clara didn't answer with grand pronouncements. She simply folded the blanket and adjusted a stuffed rabbit that Mel had been insistent on sleeping with. The rabbit, frayed at a seam, had been a companion for years, a tiny talisman she kept from the day she started. The rabbit would later become a quiet through-line in the house's story, a marker of tenderness and of the way small things bear witness to big choices. When she left the room, the house settled into its ordinary rhythms, but the afternoon had shifted, as if the axis of a small world had tilted. Clara busied herself with preparing dinner. Her hands moved in practical gestures. Renan took a call that pulled him away to a meeting he could not postpone. The kiss in the library hovered like a thing set on a shelf. Both of them had placed it under glass to see if it would catch the light. That evening, as night came on again like something inevitable, Clara sat on the back steps for a few minutes, palms warm on the wooden rail. The air smelled of jasmine and steamed bread from the kitchen. She thought of the life she had almost carved out last night and the way it had been trimmed by a man's fear. She thought of the kiss, what it meant, and what it didn't erase. Renan found her there, the silhouette of the house behind him. He sat a respectful distance away and didn't speak at first. The night allowed them a neutrality it would not elsewhere. "I'm trying," he said finally, the words both a promise and a warning. Clara looked at him. "So am I," she said. They sat in companionable silence that had the tremor of something unformed. The house exhaled around them, an oven timer, a child's soft breathing, the distant hum of traffic that said life goes on regardless. Each sat holding small truths they were not yet ready to offer freely. When Renan stood to leave, he hesitated. "Clara," he began. She met his eyes. "Yes?" He swallowed. "Tomorrow. We'll have a meeting about schedules and about, what's appropriate." She felt a tired, private smile that was less about victory and more about the recognition of the slow business of living. "Make the meeting useful," she said, "and make sure Mel's schedule doesn't become an excuse to govern my life." He nodded. Agreed. They said goodnight without ceremony. The two truths they held, her claim to her life and his fear of its drifting into things he couldn't name, sat side by side like fragile plates on a tablecloth. Neither could yet fully take responsibility for the ways the other had been hurt or protected. The evening had not settled anything, but it had moved them both, a hair's breadth toward the complicated work that would follow. As Clara closed the back door of the house and the kitchen light blinked off, she imagined other nights and other choices. Her life outside the house would still be modest, the subway rides, the double shifts, but there would be, she promised herself, an insistence on small joys. Perhaps she would go to the theater alone, or take a night to sit at a bench and watch strangers pass without judgment. For now, the edges were frayed and uncertain, but the possibility of something like autonomy echoed in her chest, a small drumbeat that would not be quieted. She did not sleep well that night. The library's kiss resounded in her thoughts, a stone dropped into the calm of familiar life. It didn't solve anything, and it didn't cancel what came next. But it had altered the atmosphere slightly, as if once you allowed yourself to ask for another life, the world replied with possibilities you had not expected to find. Morning would bring schedules and the ledger of duties. It would bring a man accustomed to buying solutions, and a woman who had just discovered how costly her integrity could be. The day ahead would be faithful to its ordinary demands. Mel's breakfast, the folding of laundry, the quiet work of making a home run smoothly. Yet under and between those chores pulsed the new and dangerous knowledge that choices had consequences and that the household's invisible architecture could crack open at any moment. Clara tied Mel's shoelaces that morning with hands that had been given no rest, and as she knelt, she felt the small tremor of something tightening somewhere near her throat. She wanted to protect the child from adult barters, from the ways tidy envelopes could be offered in place of apologies. She wanted to hold her own self steady when the wind of other people's expectations blew hardest. Renan left for the office with a briskness that was both old pattern and new discomfort. He walked away as a man who knew how to organize meetings and crisis responses, but not how to measure the invisible currency of dignity. He had that morning prepared a schedule meeting, as if a spreadsheet could mediate what had happened in the library. He had, in his way, already set his mind to a fix that would show kindness, but perhaps miss the point. Clara watched from the hallway as he left. The house was full of small actors, maids, a driver, the soft clock on the mantel, and the day pivoted on those tiny movements. She went about her work with the same devotion she always had. The world that paid her bills demanded diligence. The world that fed her soul required courage. She was, in that moment, an unlikely intersection of both. She would have to decide in the days to come what she would accept and what she would refuse. The night's events had already sketched out the map of danger, the easy offering of a check as a balm, the temptation to let money cover a wound it could not heal. It had also sketched out a different map. The possibility that both men like Renan and women like her could learn to be better, not instantly, but by the slow arithmetic of presence. But for now, the ledger was open, and the entries were still wet. A soft notification from her phone, a text from her friend with a broken heart emoji and a promise to reschedule, slid across her screen. She typed back a brief answer, then set the device aside. The day's practicalities were many, and each demanded a portion of her attention that made thinking about consequence both urgent and taut. In the laundry room, a pair of socks came loose from a small bundle and fell to the floor like an unspoken thing. Clara bent to pick them up, and in that simple motion she felt the weight of choice settle into her bones. The house held its breath. The world waited. The small life she had chosen was not without cost. And somewhere in the afternoon, in the safe hush of a library, two adults had admitted that they were at once vessels of each other's pain and strangers who might, with enough will, learn to ask for something better. The envelope waited on the corner of the dining table like a small neutral thing, as if paper could not carry the taste of an evening. Renan had placed it there before he left for work, an attempt at repair in his tidy transactional language. Clara watched it for a long time, while Mel drew a crooked sun at the table, and Donna Matilda's portrait presided over the room like an audience waiting for a verdict. When she moved toward the envelope, her hand did not shake. The flap gave with that soft, final sound of paper separating from glue. Inside, a few bills, more money than she made in a week, folded like an offering. Renan had thought of compensation first, as if time taken could be repaid by currency. The logic was old and familiar. Discomfort solved by transfer. Shame smoothed by a check. She picked up a bill and turned it in her fingers. It had the soft, antiseptic smell of new prints. Mel hummed and chewed a piece of toast, unaware of the weight that the adults had sewn into the corners of the day. Clara's throat tightened with a flavor of resentment that had been building like sediment in her chest. It wasn't merely the money, it was what the money implied. That her small claim to a night out, to being allowed to choose what to wear, could be erased by a neat fold of paper. Dignity, she thought, did not come with numbers stamped along its edge. She folded one corner of the bill and, with a deliberate motion that surprised her own hands, she tore it. Not dramatically, just enough to make the act irreversible. The paper split with a soft, intimate sound. It felt as if she were tearing a small ledger, an accounting she had been forced into for too long. Donna Matilda's shadow moved in the doorway like a remembering of propriety. "Is everything all right?" she inquired, voice thin as a lace curtain. Clara did not look up. "Yes, everything's fine," she said, and her voice was steady because it had to be. She would not make the spectacle of outrage. She would make a quiet claim. She crumpled the torn edge and put the pieces back inside the envelope, not accepting them as recompense. When Renan returned that evening, arriving with the crisp stride of a man who could file a report faster than he could understand a heart, he found the envelope exactly where he'd left it, yet diminished in a way that would strike at him later. He noticed the slight jag at the bill and, with a small, private confusion, understood that she had refused his method of repair. "Clara," he began, careful, as if speaking to glass. She held up a hand. Don't. He stared at her with a look that was both bewilderment and offense. Men like him had practices for fixing things. Ledgers, consultants, quiet dinners to smooth awkwardness. This wasn't a line item he could tick off. This isn't about money, she said. Your envelope doesn't fix the way you decided who I am last night. Renan's face hardened for a moment. The old reflex against criticism, an almost childlike recoil, showed in the set of his jaw. I only wanted to make sure you didn't feel inconvenienced. You thought money would be the answer, she said. You thought if you put a number on it, the night you cancelled for Mel would be evened out. But you keep forgetting that my days and nights aren't just numbers. He listened, and for once his instinct to explain slowed into something else, a crack of curiosity. What would you have wanted? He asked, as if asking might be a step toward a different language. To be seen as a person who can choose an evening, she said, not as someone whose dresses are a problem, not as furniture, not as an image to be managed. He looked at her then with a gravity she had seldom seen, an honest attempt to read beyond protocols. I don't always know how, he said. I don't know what to do when the world feels fragile. And you don't get to make it fragile for me, Clara said. You don't get to make other people's nights into yours to decide. Her resignation followed like a consequence. She had prepared it carefully, an act of economy and dignity. To stay meant money and a roof and a child's smiles. To leave meant uncertainty and rent notices and the small practical terrors of missing a paycheck. Still, staying under conditions that turned her personhood into a negotiation felt like a cost she couldn't pay forever. She said the words out loud only once because she believed in the concrete force of speech. I'm resigning. I can't be in a house where my life is constantly up for negotiation. Renan went pale, as if he had been cut. His first instinct was, predictably, to offer more money, more ways to soothe. No, he said quickly, as if he feared she might actually mean it. You don't have to. I already told you, she said. The envelope isn't enough. Mel, who had been coloring at the table, looked up then with the casual cruelty of children, perfectly honest and entirely unfiltered. You're leaving? She asked, voice small. The question made the room tilt in a new angle. Clara knelt and pulled Mel into her lap, burying her face in the child's small hair. The child smelled like jam and lavender and the unguarded bravery of small bodies. In that tight fold of a moment, Clara felt the press of responsibility that had always been her anchor. I'll be back for school, she murmured to Mel, because it was what the child needed to hear. But inside she had no guarantee. Resignation, for all its dignity, had the immediate cruelty of practical consequence. That night she packed a small bag. She folded clothes with a care that was almost ceremonial, as if by arranging her things she could order the chaos that awaited. Donna Nade, her mother, sat at the kitchen table with a lamp that made the bills look like a small constellation. The worry in her voice was a physical thing. You sure about this? Donna Nade asked. Her hands moved in the old gestures of women who knew how to stitch financial fears into shopping lists. Clara met her mother's eyes. I am, she said. I can't keep being someone else's compromise. Donna Nade reached across and squeezed her hand. The squeeze was full of practical dread and of pride. Then we'll manage, she said, fierce in the way only someone who had known hunger could be. We'll stretch things. We always have. Clara took the bag and walked out into the night with the small, stubborn steadiness of someone who had decided to be the author of her own fate. From the top of the street she looked back once. The house was a dark silhouette, except for a single library window where a rectangle of light shone like an accusation. Her walk to the bus stop was steady, the air sharp and smelling faintly of the jasmine vines she left behind. She felt something like liberation, braided with the bitter taste of loss. The next morning the house felt newly clean, too clean, each cushion in place as if the absence of a person allowed the furniture to arrange itself into better themes. Valeria arrived like a piece of the household's new signage, efficient, quiet, speaking little, and doing enough to be invisible. She wore a neutral smile and a tight bun that declared her professional distance. Mel watched Valeria with a watchful sadness. Children notice absences as if they are holes in a cloth. Within days, Mel's laughter was smaller, her color slightly washed. She still played, but the edges of play were quieter, less inventive. The rabbit-stuffed animal that had been Clara's quiet through-line sat on a shelf, its seam mended by another pair of hands. The child touched it now the way you touch something fragile you've learned to keep at a distance. Renan moved through the house in a gait that tried to be unnoticeable, as if his presence might soothe the loose threads. He had, in private, tried to reconcile his own feelings with the weight of his behavior. He called Clara. He called many times, and each ring went unanswered until finally, in a raw moment that did not fit his usual scripts, he left a message that was less corporate and more human. Clara, I missed the way the house was when you were here. Come by, please. Mel needs you. It was not an order. It was an admission that the household had lost something practical and essential. But Clara resisted the urge to return. Her pride and her dignity were not simple things to fold back into the house. She wanted, she deserved, a relationship where her autonomy was not bartered away. Then the day the building incident happened, everything rearranged with a force neither had expected. A neighboring structure, part of Renan's company's new development, had a scaffolding failure. Dust rose like a monstrous dusk, and a chain of events at the office created a pressure on Renan that was not about spreadsheets, but about guilt and the terrible possibility of blame. He found himself in the hub of frantic voices and terse orders, and the old control he relied on slipped like a rug pulled from underfoot. He called Clara because he couldn't call his lawyers, his board, or even his mother in that raw, unmoored hour. He called the person who, despite their rupture, had understood the smallness of a child's nightmares and the tenderness of a bandaged knee. Clara, he said, voice small and frayed, can you come? I need you just to be here. She hesitated. Her answer could be a refusal, a principled boundary. Or it could be a human act of compassion that did not necessarily mean she would return to the old arrangement. She thought of Mel's voice, a thin thread in her memory. She thought of the rabbit on the shelf and of Donna Nade's hands. She went. When she arrived, the house smelled like lemon oil and fear. Renan opened the door as if expecting judgment. For a moment, the old hierarchy clicked into place again, the man who paid and the woman who helped. But this time the roles felt less clean, like worn-out parts of a machine that had been used too long. He let her in with a nod that was neither command nor plea, just an acknowledgement that he needed the small solidity she brought. Inside, the household was a fractured glass of nerves. Davos, his chief of operations, was barking into a phone, a clipboard bouncing like a nervous bird against his side. The driver hovered by the back entrance. Donna Matilde sat in a chair, hands clasped so tight the knuckles were white. Clara moved through the rooms with a calm that was almost surgical. She made tea because people who are flustered need the ritual of hot water. She tied Mel's hair back into a crooked ponytail and soothed the child's worry with a story about a rabbit who was brave because he had to be. Her presence was not a return to the old servitude. She had come as someone who understood care. The house, unaccustomed to her being there without wage agreements and schedules, softened. Renan watched her work and felt a strange, unfamiliar gratitude that was not easily expressed in balance sheets. The crisis in the office had not been solved with money. It had been a tangle of human decisions and structural oversights. In the late hour, When the adrenaline subsided and the evening's edges rounded off, he realized how much of his daily life had been held by Clara's ordinary competence. He was, in the nakedness of his exhaustion, grateful for that competence as a human would be grateful for a hand held in mid-fall. "Stay," he said that night, finally. "Just stay." She hesitated because the world offered complicated bargains. But the request came without the envelope on the table, without an attempt to purchase absolution. It was a poor little human offer, but an honest one. She agreed to stay that night, not as an employee to be directed, but as someone who could offer calm and presence when things felt cataclysmic. They sat up late, the two of them in the kitchen with mugs that bore old rings, and the kind of stain no expensive coasters could erase. They did not speak of the kiss in the library or the torn bill. They spoke instead about small things. Mel's obsession with the rabbit's missing ear, the brand of tea that made the child's eyes light up, how you folded a fitted sheet without losing your patience. Renan told her, haltingly, about the day the scaffold had bent and the way a man on site had shouted, terrified, and how the sound had lodged in his chest. Not as a confession to guide her pity, but as a map of the fear he'd been feeling. Clara listened, not with the indulgence of someone giving weight to power, but with the careful attention of someone who was seeing a human exposed. There was a tenderness in that late-night hour that felt like a thread both of them could pull toward repair. But Clara kept the thread careful and short. She slept on the sofa in the living room, in a chair that was less comfortable than the bed she didn't touch, aware of the boundary she was maintaining, even in an act of care. When dawn scraped its thin light across the marble, Renan rose early to take calls. He moved back into the armor of the executive. The crisis had not vanished, and responsibilities resumed their old gravity. In one of the first sober moments of the day, he slipped into his briefcase a sum of money and, as a reflex, walked to the table and placed it where the envelope had been. Habit was a hard thing to break. Clara watched him across the kitchen like a person watching a familiar shadow. The gesture irritated her less now, because yesterday's tears had not erased his gratitude, but it bothered her in principle. A man had broken open his world and asked for human steadiness. A man had not yet learned to make reparation that respected the autonomy of the one he'd hurt. He looked at her as if seeking permission to be forgiven with a payment. "For last night," he said, "and for everything I messed up." She picked up the bill and folded it neatly this time. Instead of tearing it, she slid it into her bag. "I'll keep it as a reminder," she said. "Not as a reason to stay, but as a lesson that money isn't always what fixes things." Renan looked at her with a mixture of offense and revelation. She could have accepted the money. Instead, she kept it as a talisman of boundaries. There was something in that decision that struck him more deeply than any sum. He was, of course, still a man who knew how to revert to patterns. Later that week, he offered a different kind of restitution, an arrangement he thought might be generous, increased salary, paid holidays, a formalized schedule. It was, in his estimation, magnanimous. For Clara, it felt like a new chain, handed in the polite packaging of benefit. "Keep the job," he said. "We can make it official. We'll change the rules." Clara listened to the offer and let it sit like a foreign coin. She had come to a place where her principle mattered more than the comfort of a ready solution. "No," she said, and her voice surprised even herself with its steadiness. "I won't accept a new contract from the same man who told me I couldn't go out because of the way I wore a dress. I won't have dignity be something for sale under new terms." He looked stricken, and for a second the old authority tried to recover its footing with a cheap charm. But she was resolute. Her resignation was not performative. It was the product of a long accumulation of small erasures. She left because she needed to be someone in the world who was not routinely negotiated. After she was gone, the house became sharper at the edges. Too much order, too precise, the way a trimmed hedge loses the birds that used to make it noisy. Valeria was efficient, but undemonstrative. The rhythms of warmth Clara had created, small hand gestures, little story traditions with Mel, were difficult to replicate. Mel's drawings lost some of their bright invention. The rabbit sat on the shelf like an artifact, whose meaning shifted with the absence. Renan noticed the change like a physical ache. He found himself standing by the children's bookshelf, opening a picture book and reading aloud in the quiet hours, because the absence of the woman's voice felt like a loss he could no longer ignore. His mother noticed the diminished warmth and reprimanded him gently. Donna Matilde's comments, once sharp and public, now contained a softness. "You should have been kinder," she told him once over tea, and the words landed with a sting that didn't feel like critique, but like truth. 2 weeks of the sterile routine dragged like a slow fever. The company incident faded from headlines, but the household's rift remained raw. Renan did what he could in the language he knew. He tried to fix the void with careful gestures, new toys for Mel, carefully arranged playdates, charitable donations in Clara's name. None of it filled the small human ways she had held the day. At work, the accident's shadow lingered. Renan began to stumble through meetings with a weariness that made him less quick, less slick. One afternoon during a presentation, he felt something shift under his feet. The room blurred, and the air seemed thick as cotton. He had not slept well. The responsibility of lives and the gossip that had trickled through upper-level circles made his appetite for control brittle. Later that day, he walked out of the boardroom and found himself in the stairwell, hands braced against the cold tile, and for the first time in a long time, the carefully managed man was unstitched. His breath came short. He thought of Clara's hands with the smallness of her tasks, of how she folded a blanket with a tenderness no consultant could buy. He thought of Mel's laugh and the way it had softened arguments into tolerable things. That night, he drove to the district where Clara lived, a working-class neighborhood whose streets he had seldom traversed. The house numbers were smaller, the air smelled of frying food from small restaurants, and the unperfumed honesty of people's lives lived plainly. He walked up the stoop in his coat, and on impulse that was both self-humbling and absurd, took off his shoes before knocking. He had read once, somewhere, of people who showed deference by removing their footwear in the homes of others. For a man like him, used to polished floors and the rustle of banknotes as answers, the act felt like stepping out of a role. Clara opened the door and saw him with wet eyes, an image disorienting enough to unbalance any carefully built narrative. She gestured for him to sit at her small kitchen table. He looked around as if seeing her life for the first time. A chipped mug on the counter, a framed photo of Donna Need with a small braid in her hair, a stack of textbooks Clara used to take night classes, their edges soft from use. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and the simple word carried with it an implausible humility. They sat across from each other in a kitchen that smelled of oil and the modest hope of meals cooked without garnish. He didn't bring an envelope. He brought his unadorned self, which, for someone like him, was harder. He spoke not in bullet points, but in fumbling sentences that sought amends not bought by numbers. "I couldn't stand it," he admitted, after a silence that was almost a confession. The house felt like an echo. "I thought I could buy it back with more order, but—" He stopped, feeling the inadequacy of language. Clara looked at him without the dramatics of a scene in which forgiveness was expected. "This is not an apology you can buy," she said, "and I'm not asking to be bought." "I know," he said, eyes steady. "I came because I needed to see you. Not as someone who fills a role, but because I wanted to know if you were alive. If you were—" He broke off, finding that even a CEO could not finish some sentences. They drank coffee in companionable silence. The city outside continued its plain, unglamorous life, buses wheezing, a neighbor calling for bread. Renan spoke then, carefully, about ways he was willing to change, not in statements of grand gestures, but in small, measurable shifts. He would start therapy, he said, He would learn to listen better. He would not, he promised, make decisions about someone else's life for the sake of image. He would, he insisted, be present in ways that mattered. Time for Mel, small domestic tasks he had never done before, an acknowledgement when he overstepped. Clara listened and let his words settle. It was one thing to offer platitudes. It was another to show a willingness to do the slow, unromantic work of habit change. "How will I know?" she asked. The question was practical. Her life depended on measurable changes, not on speeches that made her feel small. He answered with specifics. He would attend therapy. She could ask for reports or for a friend to witness his attempts. He would commit to never making a decision about her clothing or social time without discussing it with her first. He would agree to have a mediator if it helped, a third person who could ensure his promises were not just words. His proposals were not perfect, and they did not erase what had happened. But they were concrete. There was, painfully, a kind of accountability in listing the steps. Clara sat with the list, feeling the old ledger shape her life. To accept him back into any orbit would require her to keep boundaries firm and conditions clear. She did not want to be rehired into silence. She had learned in her time away the raw value of small liberties. An evening out without question, a laugh shared in a corner that was hers. "I need to keep my apartment," she said at last. "I need to keep my classes. I need to be sure that when I say no, you respect it." He nodded. "I will." The utterance was not a magic absolution, but the posture of a man trying to be accountable. They built a fragile agreement across the chipped table. She would come by sometimes, as a friend who helped with the child's routines when he asked her. But she kept her life separate. She would not return as an employee bound to be managed by his fears. He would accept therapy, and he would show up in non-performative ways, school pickups, bedtime stories, asking Mel how her day had been. Clara did not promise the kind of romantic surrender some might expect. She retained her agency. She let him in as a person who had to do the work, not as someone whose presence would immediately absolve a history. There was a practical strictness in her decisions. No cohabitation, separate finances for a long time, transparency about his steps. Months moved like domestic weather. The agreement proved not a narrative ladder to an easy, happy ending, but a road of small, often stumbling efforts. Renan missed cues and learned to apologize more often. Apologies, when they came, were not gifts but acknowledgments. He carried the scar tissue of his grief but tried to rework it into something that could carry a child and a friend rather than a performance of propriety. Clara returned to night classes. She studied business administration because it felt useful and because she liked the bluntness of numbers when they were honest, and acquired skill gave a person leverage that was not humiliating. She worked part-time at a community center where her knack for organization made her indispensable. Money remained a practical worry, but Donna Nade took on extra shifts, and the two women made dinners that were laughter-ridden and thin on fancy. Mel bloomed in the middle of that slow change. The child's play recovered the bright, unscripted edge it had lost. She took to learning to whistle with a tinny attempt that made Clara laugh, and Renan clapped too loudly in encouragement. The rabbit sat on the couch, its seam mended by Donna Need's careful stitches, and occasionally Mel would take it outside, the toy a small ambassador between households. Renan made ritual things. He began to take a day each week to be home in the late afternoon and read to Mel on a chair that had once felt foreign. He learned the names of playground equipment he had never cared about, and learned to carry a child's small fears without becoming a man who managed everything by a press release. He sometimes failed. He once forgot a bedtime and came back apologetic and contrite. His failure did not erase the work, but reminded everyone that change is messy. The torn envelope had not disappeared into the trash. Instead, Renan kept its pieces tucked into a small drawer of his desk, a private relic of a moment he had thought could be bought and then understood could not. One late evening, on a whim that was both foolish and tender, he had framed the remaining paper slivers under glass and set them on a shelf in his study, an awkward shrine to a lesson learned too late for comfort. He meant it to be a reminder to himself that money could not be the final word. The months unspooled with small human victories that were never absolute. There were arguments, sharp, necessary ones, about boundaries and image and the old ways that still tried to creep back. Once Renan shut down an idea she had, assuming it would upset a donor. Clara called him on it publicly at a dinner when the assumption boiled over. He listened, reddened, apologized, and then learned to consult before acting. It was neither theatrical nor sudden, but the accumulation of these small acts, showing up at a school fair late because the meeting ran over, making Mel pancakes on a Saturday when the power had failed, bringing Donna-eyed flowers at Christmas, softened the edges of his control. They did not marry their differences in a single sweeping romance. Their intimacy was not a cinematic finality, but a practiced series of mutual recognitions. They learned to laugh at domestic disasters, burned garlic bread at a barbecue that Renan insisted on manning, a recipe that turned into a charcoal anecdote. Clara taught him how to fold a fitted sheet. He taught Mel to ride a bike with training wheels in the park near Clara's apartment. These small, imperfect exercises became a scaffold for a life that was plausible rather than perfect. There were days when the old power balances reasserted themselves like a remembered ache. Renan would, without malice, lapse into a posture of decision-making, and Clara would have to remind him, to his face, sometimes in front of Mel, that her life was not a problem for him to solve. He learned to accept the friction of being called out. The acceptance was not grace, but a negotiation of habit. Donna Matilde softened, if slightly, as she began to notice that Mel was happier and that Clara's influence had made the household less brittle. She remarked once to a guest, sharp as ever, but with a crack of warmth, that the child was more likable than before. The comment was small but meant something. Social judgment softened when the concrete evidence of a child's contentment appeared. Donna-Nade, watching her daughter walk with an air of quiet confidence she had not seen before, allowed herself a small private joy. "You did good," she told Clara one evening, handing over a cup of tea. "You held your ground and didn't let them buy you back." Clara sipped and smiled, the tiredness around her eyes softened by small contentments. A textbook on the table, Mel's drawings pinned to a wall, a chipped mug in the sink that no longer felt like a symbol of survival, but of a life she had crafted from the small, honest pieces of each day. The rabbit, stitched and worn, became a talisman for the household. Mel insisted it sit at every family meal, a gentle reminder that tenderness need not be perfect to be true. The rabbit moved from house to house like a small peace treaty between them. On the wall of Renan's office, the place where contracts lived and where, for a long time, relationships had been measured in terms of risk, sat a small frame. Under glass, the torn pieces of the bill lay like a constellation, a tiny relic of a day when dignity had been defended and not purchased. Visitors who noticed it sometimes asked about its meaning. Renan, with a private smile, would tell them it was a reminder that some things could not be solved by accounts payable. One late afternoon, as summer leaned toward fall, the three of them, Clara, Renan, and Mel, found themselves in a backyard where the smell of charcoal and garlic filled the air. A small group of friends had come. Plates clattered and music hummed softly from a phone. Renan manned the grill, a place where his neatness was both a liability and a source of comic error. He burned the garlic bread, blackened at the edges, and Mel shrieked with laughter at the comedic disaster. Clara, sitting at a wobbly plastic table, watched him move with a fondness that had nothing to do with romantic surrender and everything to do with witnessing a man learn to be present in the small things. He laughed at himself, salted the food a little less formally, and remembered to bring Mel a cup of juice before the rest. It was not perfect. It was messy and real. They toasted to small things, found money from a pocket, a child's lost shoe found in the shrubs, Donna Nade's excellent salad. Conversation moved easily between the homes, and someone told a story that made them all laugh until their sides hurt. The rabbit sat at the edge of the table like an honored guest, its ears flapping with an imaginary breeze. Later, when the guests had left and the night had folded into a softer dark, Clara and Renan stood by the sink washing dishes together. Their shoulders brushed once and then again, not with the urgency of a scene, but with the comfort of two people who had chosen, often imperfectly, to keep trying. "You're not perfect," Clara said, rinsing a plate and feeling the warmth of the water run over her fingers. He smiled. "Nor are you," he replied. "Good," she said. "Mediocre is more realistic." He laughed. "Mediocre together," he offered, and the humor landed between them like a promise, not grand but plausible. Mel scampered in with the rabbit tucked under her arm. "Can we put the rabbit to bed?" she asked, voice small and hopeful. They obliged, and in the quiet ritual of tucking a child's toy into a makeshift blanket, there was a kind of domestic liturgy, a repetition of small duties that, when kept, held a life together. Years, perhaps, would show whether their arrangement endured. For now, what mattered was the steady accumulation of small acts, the times he listened instead of deciding, the moments she forgave when he was trying, and the times they both failed and then tried again. The envelope's torn pieces sat under glass as a reminder. Money could not buy dignity and presence, and the willingness to change was an ongoing project rather than a finishing line. One evening, as the city lights blinked on like a constellation of modest ambitions, Clara walked past the house where she'd once been told what to wear. She paused at the gate and looked up at the window where a sliver of light showed movement. Inside, she could imagine a scene of ordinary life. Someone folding laundry, a child laughing. She had no need to be managed anymore. Her life had room for choices and small freedoms. Renan looked out the same window, the frame of his office a silhouette against the night, and for a moment he thought of the first line that had set everything in motion. Words spoken like an edict that had the power of marble and yet ultimately failed to hold a life captive. "You're not going anywhere dressed like that." He had once used those words as armor. Now they hummed like a cautionary bell, a tiny reminder of the cost of assuming control. He had worn them and had learned, painfully and gradually, that love and care could not be negotiated through injunctions. The phrase sat now like a relic he had outgrown. They had redefined what presence meant. It was not the policing of a woman's attire, not the smoothed surface of a household without blemish. It was arriving, apologizing, doing the small, unglamorous work of being accountable. It was teaching a child to whistle and burning garlic bread and learning to fold a sheet without cursing. It was, in short, showing up. When the night folded into a close, and Mel's small breath counted steadily through sleep, Clara kissed the child's forehead and thought about the road ahead, winding, uncertain and honest. She thought about the torn envelope under glass and smiled at the irony. The pieces were kept not as proof he'd bought his way back, but as proof that a man had been willing to learn the work. She thought, too, about Donna Nade's hands, and about how, in the end, dignity had been defended, not by a dramatic reclaiming, but by the quiet insistence of a woman who refused to be traded. On the porch, Renan and Clara stood for a moment longer, neither making a grand final declaration, nor pretending the past had not left its marks. Their life, messy and imperfect, moved forward in small acts. Mel ran to them with an art project that had large, clumsy glue marks. They both crouched down to admire it, and in the bending there was a mutual recognition of the slow business of repair. "Would you have left or stayed?" Renan asked suddenly, the question both recollection and test. Clara looked at him, then at Mel, then at the rabbit sheathed in a blanket. She considered stability, the cost of her choices, and the small, particular joy of being present where she chose to be. "I left," she said finally, "and I came back on my terms." He nodded, and the night held that as a small, fragile truth. They went inside together, the door closing behind them on a day that had been a hinge rather than a finish. If this story lands with you, if the quiet, complicated work of being human feels important, share it with someone who appreciates the slow, honest kind of change. And if you had to choose, what would you have done in Clara's place? Would you have stayed, or would you have left?